Welcome to Queerstories of Recovery. In this episode, the focus turns to the life and work of Professor Lisa Quinones, a native New Yorker, SUNY Maritime College lecturer, and award-winning writer. From her roots in Manhattan and Queens to her longtime home in the Bronx, Lisa has spent her career combining academic rigor with a deep passion for Latinx literature and storytelling. As the founder of the blog Atypical Familia and a contributor to publications like the Huffington Post and Latina, Lisa has dedicated herself to fostering inclusive dialogue for parents raising children with autism. Today's conversation explores her journey as a sober academic and offers an inside look at her debut memoir in progress, Atypical Motherhood. This is a deep dive into how resilience, literature, and the atypical path can rewrite the narratives of family and recovery alike.
Lisa is a fellow traveler of recovery. She's a native New Yorker, a lecturer at SUNY Maritime College, specializing in Latinx literature, and she is a powerhouse writer whose work has appeared in the Huffington Post, Latina, and Parents. She's also the founder of the award-winning blog Atypical Familia. Lisa, you've navigated the streets of Manhattan and Queens, you found a home in the Bronx, and now you're navigating academia while rewriting what it means to live an atypical life. I'm really honored to hold space with you today, so please unmute, introduce yourself, talk to me, let's get this convo started.
Okay, you can hear me.
That's good. Right.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here with you today. I know we've connected on Instagram and in a Zoom room, so it's nice to be here with you. Just sharing this space and to talk academia and sobriety. Those are two worlds that I never thought would collide or that I'd be a part of, which is wild.
Yes, and I want to start first with where you live. You lived across various boroughs, and in recovery, we often talk about geographics, trying to change our outside to fix our inside. But for somebody who identifies as perhaps a lifelong New Yorker, the city is part of your bone marrow, right? And so my question is, how does the rhythm of New York City sort of shape who you are and also how you move into the world of academia, even in the world of sobriety? Like, how does that New York energy show up in classrooms and in recovery rooms?
Oh, that's an interesting. I mean, I don't know any other way because I am a native New Yorker. I was born in Manhattan, raised in Queens, for the first 25 years of my life, and then 25 years ago I moved to the Bronx, and I've been here ever since. So I really consider the Bronx my home. I love the Bronx, and I live here, I work here, I graduated from Lehman College, so it really is a privilege that I get to teach there too. I get to show up, my students, they see me on the bus, they see me at Target, they've seen me at Orchard Beach, they have seen me, everywhere, by myself, with my son, and I think for specifically my CUNY students, I think it brings them a certain level of comfort to see a professor that looks like them, that lives in their neighborhood. It feels familiar. One of my students, I've seen my students at my gym, that's always interesting. I have a student who works at the supermarket that I go to, so I see her. She's no longer my student, but I see her multiple times a week, and it feels good when I see them and they see me with my son, and she's like, "Hey, professor, what are you teaching this semester?" I don't think, I don't take that relationship that I have with my students for granted. I love it. I feel like that's such a big part of teaching for me.
Yeah, and I love that you share that. I laughed because currently I teach at Kane University. And I also teach, that's in Jersey, and I also teach at the College of Staten Island. And in these two spaces, I still experience the same thing that you did. So if I'm in Staten Island and I'm in Target, I'll see a student that I had, and I'm not plugging up branding, by the way. I'm just saying space for geographic wise. There's no free ads here, okay?
Yeah.
But I will see students and they'll be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" Or I'll even in Jersey. And I like that because what it teaches us is that, you still have these relationships beyond the classroom. Some would say like, well, that's not really New Yorker, right? Because being New Yorker is kind of like tough, got a chip on your shoulder. But I actually think that that's also another way that we're sort of, misunderstood, because I think within the larger community of New York and even the spaces of boroughs, there's also these other like subcultures and subalterns and even these like mini like communities. And the classroom gets to be one of those communities. So thank you for sharing on that. My next question. So, we know that academia can be a site of immense pressure, and let's be honest, it often has a very specific, as I said earlier, wine and cheese culture that could be exclusionary, whether that's at the end of the semester graduation ceremonies, especially in the humanities, conferences. And, we've started this idea with like, okay, aside from the wine and cheese, we also have this like academic altar of like overproduction. Okay, so how do you balance the intellectual rigor that's required of teaching, especially in communities like SUNY Maritime or CUNY Lehman, that also like require a certain level of vulnerability, perhaps maybe like with students, or even like just of your own understanding about your recovery and practicing it long term with the demands of the work-life balance?
That's been an interesting road to navigate. I have been, I'm coming up on 8 years sober, and I can't even, a day at a time. I can't believe it. My sober date is May. I'm like, my sober date is May 6th, 2018. So 8 years, and I've been teaching. I've been in academia for about 9 years. So it's like it's been like side by side that I've had to navigate this. In the beginning, it was, I was still working full time. I was still working a full time job and teaching part time. And then, eventually I was able to leave that full time job and just focus on teaching. And I really am lucky to have found a full-time position, at a school like SUNY Maritime, which I absolutely love. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity. But, for many years, I did that adjunct hustle where I'm navigating between like 2 and 3 different schools, like teaching at Lehman, teaching at Maritime, teaching at, I taught a semester at the University of Connecticut and doing that reverse commute. Teaching at Mercy College, teaching at Bronx Community College, always like looking, right? And being a single parent and having a son with special needs, and trying to maintain my recovery, and in the process trying to trying to write again, right, in recovery, which has been probably like my biggest challenge. But I'm very transparent about my recovery. I don't play around with that. One of the first things, I think I went to a Christmas party, and this was like a few years ago, maybe it was like 4 years ago. I went to a Christmas party, and it was at a bar. And I'm like, oh, this is, different. But I felt like, I have to do these things. So much of academia and it's like the networking, right? And networking outside of, the department, and typically it's in a bar. And I'm like, okay, well, I have a purpose for being there. I can get there, on time, right? Early, so I can, get my seat, stick with my Diet Coke and my seltzer. And I've learned that no one cares. No one cares that I'm not drinking. No one is like, oh my goodness, do you see Lisa? She doesn't, no one cares. Maybe they'll ask like, hey, do you want to drink? And I'm like, no, I have my Coke, or I'm having my seltzer. And after that, it's like, it's done. It's me. Like, it's all like in my mind. nobody cares. Nobody cares. It's just me. So I'm lucky that I've learned that, in the classroom, when it comes up, sometimes students will kind of like play around, and I'm very, how I show up in the classroom, I'm very much myself. Like, I show up with my earrings, my fade, and I need a fade right now. My nose ring, like in a hoodie, in jeans, in Converse, Vans, Doc Martens. Summers, like, I have my tattoos out. They often think I'm much younger than what I am. And, they're like, did you turn up this weekend or whatever they say? And I'm like, I don't drink. And sometimes they look a little sad for me. And I'm like, it's fine. And sometimes I'll say, I haven't had a drink in this amount of time. And, or they'll ask questions. They're all very fascinated about my tattoos, and I've gotten all my tattoos in sobriety. So they'll ask me, like, what does this mean? Or when I got to 7 years, I tattooed the number 7 on me. So they're like, what's the 7 for? Is that your lucky number? And I'm like, yeah, in a way. And then I'll say it like, I'm 7 years sober. And they're like, oh, good for you, miss. And they'll like give me the little clap. And so, they are supportive. It's interesting. I went to AWP in a couple of weeks ago, and it was my first time. I went to AWP when I was in graduate school, meant like years ago. Wow, that seems like so long ago. And I was still drinking then, but I wasn't involved. And this year I made it a point to go. I was like, I'm gonna go to AWP. If I'm going to begin writing again, I need to be in these circles. I need to be in these spaces, and I need to learn how, and I feel comfortable, right? Getting comfortable with the uncomfortable situations. But so many events were held after 6 in a bar, at a lounge, happy hour. And I didn't attend any of them, and I was okay with it. I made the panels, and what I loved, what I wasn't expecting when I got to AWP, as I was looking through the pamphlet, right, for all the panels and the events, they had sober meetings, they had recovery meetings, and I was like, I can go to a recovery meeting twice a day. I can like begin my day and end my day in a recovery meeting with other writers. I was like, that was, for me, that was like the best part of AWP, like talking to other writers who were in recovery. I was like, oh my, I found my people. Like and that's just, I think that's what a lot of us do, right? We find our people. When I was drinking, I found the people I drank with. Now I'm in recovery. I find you have to find your people.
No, and I'm actually really glad that you said that, and also just to talk about this idea of conferences. And the reality is, like, look, while it is, I would say, dominant practices of recovery, you'll get your AA, your NA, your PA. Well, not maybe PA, but you'll get maybe NA and AA, maybe just an AA and an Al-Anon meeting at conferences, because again, people who are going to conferences, you might have 1 or 2 people that are leading, and it's service that's not compensated for. And so they're bringing something outside of the conference kind of world into the conference to kind of give support. And I would say, like, that's kind of the initiative of why, like, when I go to conferences, I ensure that we have sober academic meetings, just to sort of like also break it up a little bit, because not everybody got sober. I mean, well, I have, but not everybody got sober because of AA, you know what I mean? So, and that's something to be mindful of. But I do appreciate the conversation that that you kind of talked about, how, you kind of don't have a wall between yourself and students. And I think that's important too for somebody, as a writer as well, which is like, making choices about what's visible to the world and what's not visible. And I think, like, my next question maybe, because we could dive into the sort of intersection of your identity with Latinx culture. Maybe that's rooted in family, celebration, cultural, even for cultural silences as well. But how does I would say, like, how does being sober, part of an institution of academia, help you to see the intersectionalities and even the margins of your student lives a little bit more clearly?
I want to go back. I don't have a wall between myself and my students. And, I am transparent in my recovery, in my real life and, and online, right? And for me, that works. However, I do realize it's not for everybody. It's not definitely not for everybody. And even sometimes I still question it because, it can be, um, I realize it is something that students or like anybody can use against me, right? They can use that as judgment, especially being a woman of color, being a mother, the standard, that women are held to. There's still very much a stigma around alcoholism and being a woman and being a mother. I realize, it could put me in a difficult position, but I know I cannot be the only one. I know that I cannot be the only one. So, I feel like if I guess, like, coming out, for lack of a better term, like, makes others feel comfortable, then, I'm okay. I'm okay with that. In terms of my students, I think, there have been times I don't always break my anonymity. I try not to. I feel like sometimes it just comes up naturally because, students are struggling, working with, and my students range from like 17 to, especially being in CUNY, I've had students that are older than me or were about the same age. So, that's always interesting too, like having students who I see as peers, right? Because we're the same age and we're parents and we're working and we're juggling life. You know, but I feel like so many people are in pain for multiple reasons and struggling, right? And if they're not struggling themselves, you know, they know someone who's struggling. And sometimes that comes out in the writing. And I want to be, I want to be as supportive as I can. I want to be, an empathetic ear. And again, it's finding that balance because, I'm not their mother. I'm somebody's mother. I'm not their mother. I'm not their therapist. But I take seriously the role that I play in people's lives, no matter what it is.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's so powerful, and this is not to knock on the professors who do not let the personal into the classroom. And obviously, even with allowing yourself to be seen, yourself included, myself, right? We still make choices, right, about what we disclose and what we don't disclose about our lives. And I think what tends to happen because of this sort of like the impetus of like what you need to look like, sound like, or be like in academia, you have to like not allow yourself to be seen in that kind of way, right? Like you just, consumerism, it's the job, input, output, professionalism, whatever the deal is. And I think like, if you're working in humanities, composition, rhetoric, writing, I don't know, as a kid who was closeted and struggling with alcoholism and, I didn't realize I was struggling with alcoholism even in college, but I remember the classrooms that I paid attention to the most were the classrooms where I felt like I got to see the most out of professors, you know what I mean, who had their human side, and I think, you were talking about, just even this idea of like, coming out in the reference of like coming out as somebody who, struggling with alcoholism and addiction and then being sober and what that means now to you. I think it's important to recognize how much your view of life has changed because you see the world differently now, and I think that's like really cool. But I also am aware of, and I am hearing what you're saying, that I still have to be mindful that like, while I am writing about this stuff and I am writing these articles and teaching in this kind of way, anything is up for grabs. Anything could be used against me to hurt me because this is the world that we live in today. And I think that brings me to my next question. Because I do want to get into more about like how you specialize in Latinx literature and how your identity informs the way that you not only create your pedagogy, but also how that is also a kind of resistance, even maybe in the way that you practice recovery.
I love Latinx literature, and for me to teach, to be able to teach it, really is, you know, I often tell students that, especially my Lehman students, because that's where I graduated from, um, Latinx literature is now a requirement for English majors. It was not a requirement when I was an English major. Um, I didn't read my first novel written by a Latino author until I was probably 20 years old. And this was before Google, this was before like the internet, this was before, I had to scour the bookshelves and libraries and bookstores and really seek out these authors because they just weren't, I didn't grow up with them. And I was always an avid reader, but I read, Judy Blume, which I love, and Beverly Cleary, and, The Babysitter's Club, and The Girls at Canopy Hall. Like, that's what I read. I never saw a character that looked like me or sounded like me until I read, and the first book that I read was Down These Mean Streets by Perry Thomas. And that book, and I tell students, right, I am not a man. I am not Afro-Latino. I did not grow up in the 1940s. I did not grow up in Spanish Harlem. But I identified with this author in a way that I had never identified with another author before. Like, I understood it. And then I read Esmeralda Santiago's, when I was Puerto Rican. I was like, oh my God. And again, I saw myself in a way that I had never seen myself. I saw myself, I saw and again, I didn't grow up in Puerto Rico. I don't even speak Spanish. But I understood this work, in a way that I had never understood anything else before. So, this is the work that I teach. And I tell, my students, like, you don't have to be Latino to get this. You don't have to speak Spanish. You don't have to grow up in New York or Chicago or Florida or in another country. All you have to do is, and I learned this from the rooms in recovery, to identify with the feelings. To identify with the feelings of the character, because ultimately, it's, they're universal emotions, and that's why these books are so popular, and that's why these books are so important to me, because they are universal themes: love, identity, belonging, family, right? The American dream, the ability to persevere no matter what. So to bring these authors into classrooms, right? And I always have introduced diverse authors. It doesn't matter if I'm teaching Latinx literature, I'm teaching American authors, it's a summer school course, and there's still a Latino author in there, because guess what? We're American too. It doesn't have 100%. To be like in a Latinx lit class that I can only teach Latinx authors. I teach it when I teach English composition, if I'm teaching American authors, if I'm whatever literature course or writing course I'm teaching, I am providing a diverse range of writers, because I feel like it's important, right? And I love Shakespeare, and I love, like The Great Gatsby, and there's certain books that I'm like, I understand why these books are still being read and taught and included in the syllabi, but there's so many other works that have been taught that have been written that need the same amount of attention, that they're important and they are part of the literary canon.
Like, I'm aware that, the world that I grew up in, but also to have seen it as somebody who is white, entering that space, I didn't know. I thought that was it. I thought that was literature until I went to CUNY. Until I'm not kidding. I mean, I got my undergrad in English, and I only knew about white authors and white writers. Mm-hmm. And when I went for my master's of education and my master's of English, my world completely shifted, because this is sort of the kind of legacy of literature. This is nothing to do with the canon, but this is the sort of like faces that we would see. You know what I mean? Like this is.
I love
I
that.
mean,
It's fun.
I'll have a whole podcast just on this book. I think the work that you do gives space for voices that were always part of the story, but just were never heard, right? Were never literally listened to. And I appreciate you doing that work in the classroom, for not only just for your students, but for yourself as well, right? And that's super important. And you talked a lot too about like family with your identity, and I kind of like want to turn back to that. Because you founded Atypical Familia, which is a platform for parents who are raising children with autism. And in many recovery circles, we know that service is one of the pillars of staying sober. So would you consider creating Atypical Familia as an extension of your recovery service?
Well, so that blog started, my son is 20. He's 20, which is a whole, we're moving into, special needs adulthood, which is absolutely terrifying. But, I started Atypical Familia, and originally it was called Autism Wonderland when he was 4. And we were going through the turning 5 process. So it's like 15 years ago. And I was in graduate school when I started that blog. He had just been diagnosed with autism, the May that I graduated from Lehman. So I was I was like working full time. I was graduating from Lehman College. I was applying to graduate school, and my son was like in the process of, this autism diagnosis. And I was completely devastated. And because I'm a writer and a reader, I was like, I have to get the books, right? Because that's what I did during my pregnancies. I bought like all the pregnant and what to expect when you're expecting and all those books. So my natural instinct was I'm going to go to the bookstore. I'm going to buy all the books on autism, and I'm going to become an expert, and I'm going to like fix my kid. And when I got to the bookstore and I saw, and again, I wasn't really surprised, right? When I saw the books that were written, the memoirs and all the books, they were, they were all written by upper middle class white women who had the ability to step away from their careers, to downsize their homes, to become, stay-at-home moms, to move to a different state. And I didn't have that. I was a legal assistant. I was in graduate school. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. My husband, at the time, we're not together anymore, but, he was working for FedEx. There was no, there were no careers to leave. There was no home to downsize. Moving out of state was not an option. I had to make it, I had to continue to work. His dad had to continue to work, and we needed a way to work it out. And I remember reading these books and feeling like a failure, because I'm like, if these moms who have everything are struggling, what hope do I have? And I just and I started writing, because it was a difficult process to get the services. Everything was a fight, to get occupational therapy and speech therapy and ABA, and to get them to come to the house. And I had therapists say things like, well, I don't go to that neighborhood, and all of these. I mean, it was so easy to feel defeated. And and writing was like my therapy. It was my outlet. It was my way to say, this is what we're going through, and this is what we're doing, right? Helping, and that's how it started. Okay, so these are the books that I'm reading, and these are the places that I'm calling, and this is what I'm doing to advocate for my child. And then it kind of, it really took off. But again, I'm in graduate school. I'm working full time. I'm raising this son with special needs. I'm advocating, fighting, always fighting the DOE. Um, and I'm writing every day, and for years I went on like that, and for years, I think I deserve a drink. I deserve a drink. I mean, I didn't become an alcoholic because I was an alcoholic because I'm an alcoholic, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, all, the only way that I was able to really survive that period of my life was alcohol because I just couldn't. And it fueled, right? And I had that, well, oh, this is my creative outlet, and I drink and then I write and I have my wine, and it was very, I romanticized it for a long time
Yeah.
until, and then, eventually you I hit a bottom, and I
Yeah.
couldn't, and I had stopped writing, and my son was getting older, and I was still advocating, but he was in a really good place, and he didn't require as much, and life happened, and that blog has died a slow death, right? And it's still up and it's still live, and I'll still get people emailing me or messaging me on Instagram and asking me questions, and I'm always happy to answer questions, when I can, but we're navigating a different space now, and he's turning 20, and now we have guardianship because he cannot be, you know college isn't in his future, like, for now, right? He's not the kid that's going to graduate. um he's not graduating. I mean, he's graduating, he's leaving his school, like, he's done at 21, but I don't know if college will be a possibility for him right now. Probably not, right? He still requires um, one-on-one care. He's a great kid. He's a talented kid. He's an artist. He's a writer. He's a storyteller, but he cannot navigate this world safely on his own right now. So he still requires a lot of help, and what that looks like, and so it's been a balance of me trying to write again in sobriety, and what I feel comfortable sharing about him, and when I look back at all the writing that I did for that site, for my site, and the memoir is there, right? That's part of the memoir. But the thing that I hid, right, because I protected, my drinking, was the role that alcohol played through that entire period of my life. And I think that's the story that needs to be told, because that's very much a part of the story, and
Mm-hmm.
they both go hand in hand, and that's not an easy process. Memoir is difficult because you really have to look at yourself, but you need to give yourself, and I think that there's enough time and distance. I could not do that 8 years ago or 5 years ago. I'm in a place where I can look at it in a very honest lens and say, this is what happened.
Oh, 100%. And I really value how you sort of brought us into that experience, and sort of like navigating, like, oh, alcohol was the way I coped. Like, this is extremely stressful. I'm trying to survive. I'm trying to, keep the lights on. I'm trying to take care of my child. I'm trying to also do what I need to do for myself. And I think in doing so, you've challenged so many of those cultural scripts of what it means to not only be a mother, but a Latina mother, and what a sober woman looks like, and having that experience before sobriety, and then like being forced to like a rock bottom, and then needing sobriety, and then how you're thinking about all that as you're writing your memoir is extremely powerful. And first of all, I can't wait to read it. I'm so excited. So get working, keep working on it, get writing on it. Keep doing that work. And I think, just for me personally, like, you provide your journey. I think anybody who's navigating this path, who's an academic, who is a woman of color, who is Latina, the thing that has been echoed throughout this entire episode is that I don't look like the one who's in the book. I don't look like the one who's on the brochure. my experience is different, right? And I think the resilience of you not only like showing that in the work that you do in the classroom and your writing, but also like coming on this podcast today is you also show how you take care of yourself while you're trying to, you know, take care of yourself, while you're trying to heal, while you're trying to rewrite the story. Because at the end of the day, what you're showing me, the way that I see it, is that you're not just getting through it, right? That you rose above it. You rose above these things, you know? And I think, you know, the way that you still navigate all of these issues, especially being so involved in your profession, being so involved in your son's life, being so involved in recovery, like, I think anybody who's out there who's listening, it's definitely admirable. And I know that you have something coming out, right? You have a publication coming out in October or something like that. What's the buzz? Tell me more about that.
There is, you know, and it's fun just to go back to what you said. I think, you know, alcohol is so embedded in our culture, right? It, you know, the mommy juice, the mommy wine, like, you know, wine o'clock, and it's, you know, it's become the norm, and it's so easy to see how women especially, you know, it can sneak up on so many women. I mean, for me, it was always there, but you know, there was like a certain point in my life where I just felt like I could see the progression, right? I can pinpoint the progression to like this, to a very specific day, and I was like, oh, from that point on, it was done for me. You know, but the book, you know, it's an anthology put together by Dr. Melissa Castillo at Lehman College. She put together an anthology of Latinas and the Me Too movement, right? Latinas write about the Me Too movement called Y Yo También. So I have an essay within the anthology, and I'm nervous, you know, because again, there are certain topics that, you know, culturally we do not speak about. We do not speak about alcoholism, we do not speak about drug addiction, we do not speak about abuse, we do not speak about depression or mental health. Like, these are things that are just completely off the table. You know, but more and more these works, you know, these topics are seeping its way into the literature, right? And these are stories that need to be told, because again, you know, people of color need to hear that these stories exist within our community, that exists within our community, that sexual assault exists within our community, that depression and everything that comes with the depression and mental health like exists with our community, and that people are um, recovering from these difficult things that happen, and as a result thriving in spite of them. And I think that that's important. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't, the title is called The Sex, Alcohol, and Shame Cycle, so that gives you an idea of, you know, it's like, it was hand in hand for me. So, it was probably one of the most difficult things that I had to write, and I questioned throughout the whole writing process, and I'm so grateful that I was able to write with these two other women who really just supported me, two other Latinas that really supported me, you know, we supported each other throughout the process, and I questioned, like, should I really write this? Like, should I, like, oh my, what are people, you know, because what are they gonna say? What are they gonna think of me?
Yeah.
And you know, and ultimately you know, I'm proud that I wrote it. I'm proud that I wrote it. It was a liberating experience for me, and I figure if I can help, if sharing my story can help one person navigate their own experience with assault and alcoholism, then I did what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
I
Thank
don't
you.
know if I'm gonna let my students read it. I don't know if I'm gonna shout it out to them, but
Listen, right? I love that we're ending on this idea of like writing the self is a political act, right? Writing about what we experience is a way to not only share stories, but to create community. And here you are writing with a group of fellow women who have had these experiences and how they're navigating it with their identities in mind, and I think for you, you over this episode, you've addressed like this sort of double stigma of what it means to be a woman of color, but somebody who's overcome addiction, right? And thinking about your communities as well with all of that. And also thinking about how there were a lot of social determinants around you pre-sobriety and, coming into a profession and wanting to go to graduate school and then also being a caregiver for your son who's living with autism. And I think it leaves people with the thought that, we could see how substance abuse can come into play, especially trying to do the juggling act. And having experiences that, are varied, right? That aren't that dominant white model that you saw in literature books, right?
Yeah.
Or that book, Mommy Drinks Too Much.
Mommy Drinks Too Much. They need a 2026 edition with Mommy
podcast.
And I because I feel like there's this almost as if there's an allowance, right? It's acceptable, right? It's seen as brave. Oh my goodness, they're so brave when they share these stories. But if me, it's like this double standard. It's a stigma, and something, writing is resistance. I tell my students like writing is an act of resistance, and it is. And I'm sure you feel like with ChatGPT, I'm like, this is not writing. This is not writing. I want your voice, your words. I want your language. I want your flavor. Like it really is resistance. And it's the one thing that no matter what, I have lost so much in my life, but the one thing that has never been able to be taken away from me is my education. And I stress that to my students, this belongs to you no matter what, no matter who's in your life, no matter your marriage falls apart, your job, you have your education and you have your knowledge, and no one can take that away from you ever. That's yours for life.
Lisa, I want to thank you so much for spending the last 45 minutes with me. And to our listeners, thank you today for joining us from the margin. So until next time, stay sober, stay critical, keep telling your truth.
As we wrap up today's conversation, for my fellow writers and academics out there, does the professor side of you ever try to edit the vulnerable side of you while you're doing this work? If today's episode resonated with you, there are plenty of ways to stay plugged into our community. Follow Queerstories of Recovery to catch our latest video content and episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, and Riverside FM. If you're interested in coming on to share your own journey of recovery and academia, Queerstories would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.